All right. Well, let's look at the preface to the book here, and this is actually I started reading the preface before I did before I jumped into the introduction here, because this is where Stokes tells us that I'm a skeptic by training and temperament, right? So he starts off with the thing that he wants to say. And the point that he makes here, and he makes several points with regard to this preface, and we just want to bring out a couple of these so that folks get a feel for where he's going here. He says when atheists make grand claims like this, for instance. So he says it's one thing to believe that there's no God, but it's quite another thing to say things like, there exists not a shred of respectable evidence for God's existence, or, quote, science shows that God does not exist, right?
So you take your petri dish, you titrate the thing, and it comes out, no God exists here.
That's right, or it's written all over the sky, right? When atheists make, he says, such grand claims, they're either frightfully ignorant of the relevant complexities, or he says they're bluffing, right? In either case, they should stop, if not for no other reason than that they're damaging their own credibility. How about that? So he's concerned about the credibility of atheists.
It seems what they're doing is they're utilizing kind of our big thing, especially in the Western world, of science. If science says it, that's the big stamp of approval.
Oh yeah,
gravity pulls things towards the earth.
Science says it, I believe it.
Water freezes at zero.
Yeah.
There's the science stamp of approval, and so by making these claims that we can scientifically prove that God doesn't exist, they're overreaching with what science is doing, and therefore hurts what true science does.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and he says they should exercise some intellectual restraint. Right, is what he's suggesting. He says part of the solution is to realize and admit that belief and unbelief are each far more than a matter of reason. Reason alone won't settle the issue. No one is neutral. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah,
right?
Romans 1.
Yeah, right. So the no neutrality thing here, right?
Yeah.
We all kind of see through our own glasses. Reason doesn't convince necessarily. I mean, it does, right? He doesn't throw out reason, right?
Right.
But he says alone, he says, won't settle the issue. So this is why debates over God, he says, God's existence can sometimes seem like making a legal case for your devotion to your spouse, right? No matter how reasonable you are, you better get flowers.
Which I think John Lennox has actually done to Dawkins before.
Yeah.
Is your wife faithful? Can you prove it?
Yeah. So what he wants to do here is he wants to try to work through these particular issues with regard to skepticism, right? He says, the lesson I claim is that uber optimism about science leads to moral skepticism along a path through atheism. And then he parenthetically says, or what I will sometimes call naturalism, the view that the natural world is all there is. He says the problem in the garden was, at least to his light, that the folks there, Adam and Eve, weren't skeptical enough. So he says, never get into a stranger's car, no matter what kind of fruit he offers you, right?
Yeah.
So there's three claims here that, or at least three main sections of this book that he wants us to be aware of, that he's going to work through, right? Three main sections. The first section, he says, is by far the shortest. He says, I lay some epistemological groundwork. So, epistemology is a study of kind of the nature of knowledge. And
how do we know things?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So in particular, I look at the limits of what we can know in general, considering our epistemic abilities with respect to sense perception and reason, our two main cognitive faculties.
So touch, sight, taste, smell, those are the sense perceptions.
Right.
If you're looking through a microscope, that's you using your senses to identify something. Telescope, stone is rough. You're feeling it. Yeah, those types of things.
Yeah.
Reason is the 2 + 2 = 4.
Right.
If I do this, then this happens.
Right. So
is this the cause?
Yeah. Causality.
Of,
Causality. Yeah. He says then once we've gotten our epistemological bearings, I turn to science, and in particular how we should think about its methods and claims. He says, my goal is by no means to denigrate science or to deny that it tells us important and surprising things about the world, but there are also good reasons to remain agnostic, he says, even doubtful about things we cannot directly observe, and we directly observed far less than many people imagine.
So it's interesting that he's saying that science is almost a step two.
Yeah.
You have to have your senses, you have to have reason, and that gets you the ability to do science.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I don't know if people would really parse that out as particularly as what he is.
So most people would think that science is its own foundation, and what he's implying here is no, there is a further foundational, we might even call, philosophical foundation here with regard to our epistemic abilities. We have to hold that they are, at least to a certain extent, lead us to a proper take on the way the world is, right? And our cognitive abilities. So we have to have some assumptions about those before we even get off the ground with regard to science.
Do our senses tell us the truth?
Yeah.
Are they accurate? How accurate are they?
Yeah.
Are we able to use them in time and place, or are they universal? So there's a lot there, and then we have the ability to do science utilizing those tools.
So science, given that particular take on it, isn't really the foundation. It stands on the foundation of these other two types of things that we have to almost make some assumptions about before we even get science off the ground. And sometimes this is called a criticism of scientism. Scientism is the idea that science is the only discipline that gets us to the truth, right? Well, clearly, if it has a foundation these are more philosophical, this foundation, than science, then it can't be, the only discipline to get us to the truth, because the foundation of science aren't scientific claims. They're more philosophical claims, right?
You couldn't do science on science to get it.
Yeah.
So you have to appeal to a more foundational, a more basic set of ideas, like senses or reason, logic. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. He doesn't want to. So his first claim is with regard to this issue here. He looks at the limits of what we can know, and then he wants to kind of turn to science and consider some issues with regard to science. He says in these first two sections, much of what I have to say applies to everybody, believers and unbelievers. So that, he says we can all agree on much of what I say about epistemological limitations, including limitations of science, although the limitations are significantly worse if humans aren't the product of design, right? So he throws that in there, right? But he says, suppose that naturalism were true, further suppose that science largely supports naturalism. What implications does this have? And here's his third issue here. For our standard view that there are objective moral standards, right? So he's going to do some epistemology, and then he's going to apply that to thinking about science, and then he wants to move to morality with regard to what he wants to discuss here, right? So he says in the third section, I'll argue that if naturalism is true, then there are no such standards, that is, objective moral standards. So we saw this in one of our previous episodes, and we'll put a link here to refer to that. But this is the don't answer type deal. He's not saying that he accepts the viewpoint of the unbeliever by saying here's the be all end all. But if naturalism were true, what are the implications of that? And then showing skeptics that here's the conclusion that you would reach if this were the case.
Yeah, especially with regard to morality, right? Objective morality, right?
Yeah.
How does that?
You seem to lose it.
Yeah. That's really what he's going to argue here, right? That somehow we get. He says most atheists, however, would loathe to agree with his position with regard to objective morality, right? Their reluctance, he says, is understandable, but if they're serious about their skepticism, about following reason wherever it leads, he says, he believes they will reluctantly agree, or at least he would if he were an atheist.
Yes, so he's calling atheists to be, or skeptics at least, to be better skeptics.
Yeah, to be consistent skeptics, right? To follow your skepticism out on every issue, not just the things that you want to be skeptical about, but let's apply it consistently across the board, even with regard to your atheism, even with regard to science or anything else, right?
Right.
Let's be skeptical about all of it if we're going to be skeptical.
Why stop at point B? Why not continue to point A or down to point Z?
Yeah. And we'll see here that he admits to being a skeptic, so he doesn't think it's anything wrong with it, but he's going to argue that you need to have the right kind of skepticism.
Well,
right?
and we would take this with any truth claim, especially large truth claims. Joseph Smith comes to us and says, "I found the lost gospel on golden plates." Should you automatically believe, or should you apply skepticism?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like skepticism would cause you to be held back from believing absolutely anything and buying any type of snake oil or whatever might happen.
Golden plate books or whatever.
But however, if someone says,
I don't know what they were worth. How much gold?
well, they were taken back up to heaven. So
he didn't get a chance to keep them.
But if we had extreme skepticism on things like the polio vaccine, well, then we'd all still be dying from polio.
I'm not taking that. Yeah. I don't know. How do I know that? How I know that? You're going to give me polio in order to cure polio? What is up with that, right? Yeah.